Trump and Vance versus Zelensky. Hello, I'm H.G. Tudor. The world's press has commented extensively on the exchange that took place in the Oval Office between President Zelensky of Ukraine, President Trump of the United States, and his Vice President, J.D. Vance. It's often the case that when leaders get together, there's a lot of show, shaking of hands and smiles, and there isn't necessarily the plain speaking that actually occurred in this particular meeting. Once again, it is through the prism of narcissism and understanding the narcissistic dynamic that we have a fantastic opportunity to understand much of what went on. Irrespective of what your stance might be with regard to what you think were the rights and wrongs of what took place, either side will interpret it in a particular way. There'll be those, for instance, that think that Zelensky came with his begging bowl and expected a payout and didn't get it and therefore had a huff. And there'll be others that will believe that Zelensky's doing the very best for his country and was treated disgracefully by two supposed statesmen. Whatever your views are in respect of that, I'd invite you to try and put them to one side in understanding the dynamic between the three individuals, as this is about the narcissism that's on display. Let's have a look at the first clip before we get into analysing it.
Yes, content. Yes, but after that, he broke this ceasefire. He killed our people, and he didn't exchange prisoners. We signed the exchange of prisoners. But he didn't do it. What kind of diplomacy, JD, you are speaking about? What do you mean?
I'm talking about the kind of diplomacy that's going to end the destruction of your country.
Yes, but if you
Mr. President, with respect, I think it's disrespectful for you to come into the Oval Office and try to litigate this in front of the American media. Right now, you guys are going around and forcing conscripts to the front lines because you have manpower problems. You should be thanking the president for trying to bring it into this conflict.
Have you ever been to Ukraine? Did you say what problems we have?
I have been to.
Come once.
I've actually watched and seen the stories, and I know what happens is you bring them on a propaganda tour, Mr. President. Do you disagree that you've had problems bringing people in your military? And do you think that it's respectful to come to the Oval Office of the United States of America and attack the administration that is trying to prevent the destruction of your country?
A lot of questions. Let's start from the beginning.
Sure.
First of all,
So we join the discussion whereby Zelensky is evidently explaining about some of the behaviours of President Putin of Russia. Whilst this is taking place, Trump is silent. He's appearing to listen attentively. He places his hands together as he allows Zelensky to speak, as does Vance. Vance is listening to what Zelensky has to say. It's at that point that Zelensky asks a question of Vance. What kind of diplomacy, JD, are you asking me about? It's at that point that Vance ratchets matters up and states, I'm talking about the kind of diplomacy that ends with the destruction of your country. Now, some might say that was an unnecessary remark in the context of a man that's fighting a war to prevent the destruction of his country, that it isn't necessary to say that out loud, and certainly not in a meeting between leaders. Others would say it's that kind of plain talking that is necessary at times, and perhaps that's what's necessary to be said to get Zelensky to see a particular point of view to try and bring this war to an end. As I've mentioned, we're not going to debate the ins and outs of the relevant positions, but rather look at what's happening with regard to the personalities of the individuals concerned. The observation from Vance is a provocation. It's using emotive language to talk about the destruction of your country, and with the finger pointing also, it's clear that it's provocative. It's designed to try and destabilise the attempts of Zelensky to control the meeting, with Vance needing to assert his own form of control. Zelensky seeks to answer Vance, but immediately he's interrupted, which demonstrates lack of boundary recognition and a sense of entitlement. Mr. President, with respect, he begins. And as we all know, that when anybody says with respect, that's the last thing that's actually on their mind. He also places his hands up, palms-wise, his palms outwards towards Zelensky, which is a physical signal for Zelensky to be quiet and is a further assertion of control on the part of Vance. He continues, I think it's disrespectful for you to come to the Oval Office and try to litigate this in front of the American media. Once again, this is provocative, and it's triangulation between him, Zelensky, and the American media. It is suggesting that Zelensky is not being fair or honest. He then continues with a classic observation that would come from a narcissist, you should. And if you've not watched my video about the narcissist's use of you should, then guess what? You should. He states you should be thanking the president. Again, irrespective of whether you believe that's correct or not, it doesn't actually matter, because it's designed to be a provocation to assert control over Zelensky. Remember, the narcissist can use the truth, a half-truth, or nowhere near the truth. Accordingly, if your position is that Vance is right about what he's saying, that Zelensky should be thanking President Trump, then Vance is using the truth for the purposes of provoking Zelensky in order to nullify his threat to control. If you don't think that that's an appropriate thing to be said and that he shouldn't have to be thanking them, then you would have a situation where you would believe that Vance is using a non-truth, an untruth. But nevertheless, the outcome is the same. So irrespective of what your position might be as to who's right or wrong in this scenario, and as I mentioned, that's not what's up for debate here. If you believe Vance is right, he's using the truth to provoke. If you think that Vance is wrong, he's using an untruth to provoke. But the outcome is the same, driven by his narcissism. Zelensky, of course, has his own situation whereby his need for control is being threatened. You'll note that he has his arms crossed in defiance. This naturally is a typical defensive move on the part of any individual that's being spoken to in circumstances where they don't like what they are hearing. He has allowed Vance to talk, but he then needs to nullify the threat to control. At first, it seems like he's managed to keep his mouth shut, and therefore would likely be utilising the third assertion of control, whereby he doesn't walk out of the meeting, but he sits there thinking to himself, well, thoughts such as, I can't believe I'm hearing this, or this man is an idiot, whereby he jettisons Vance in his own mind. However, his own narcissism can't let that lie as Vance continues to talk, and therefore Zelensky comes back with his own provocation. You should come to Ukraine, which he has said in the full knowledge of knowing that Vance has never been. Again, let me reinforce the fact that irrespective of what position you might adopt, the outcome seen through the prism of the narcissism is the same. If you think that Zelensky is right to say to him, you should come to Ukraine, then simply Zelensky is using the truth in order to provoke and nullify the threat to control posed by Vance. If you think this is not something that should have been said or is irrelevant about whether Vance goes to the Ukraine, then it might be stated that Zelensky is using an untruth, but even then it's still being used to provoke. He adds, come once. This naturally threatens the need for control that Vance has. He responds with, I've actually seen the stories. What he ought to have done, to my mind, was actually say, good, yes, I'll come and take a look. Doesn't mean that he has to follow up with it. He could future fake in his response, which would actually be more placating, more statesmanlike, and would there necessarily be any follow-up as to whether he went or not? He could claim that there were other matters that required his attention. But in that meeting, in order to nullify the threat to control and appear more statesmanlike, he could have responded, I will come then, thank you for the invitation. Instead, he says, I've actually seen the stories, and he talks about that you bring them on a propagated tour, as he's talking about the manpower issues that the Ukraine has in respect of fighting the war, that these moving conscripts. And he asks, do you agree you've got problems? Again, this is inflammatory and provocative and is designed naturally to nullify the threat to control posed by Zelensky's question about him attending the Ukraine. He then continues, however, "Do you think it's respectful to come to the United States and attack the administration which is trying to stop the destruction of your country?" Again, he may be right in what he's saying, therefore it's a provocation based on the truth. If you deem that that's an unnecessary observation, either that it's incorrect or that he ought not to have said it, then there's a mixture of a half-truth or a non-truth. Again, but it's being utilised for provocation. Throughout all of this, Trump has remained silent. In effect, he's allowing his lieutenant to land some blows on Zelensky. It's evident to my mind that there was a plan in relation to this meeting to teach Zelensky a lesson. But that's not something that we necessarily need to go into any detail because we aren't privy to what was discussed prior to this meeting. But the clear impression I gain from the nature of the exchanges and the way that Vance and Trump operated is that they deemed that it was necessary for Zelensky to receive some truths and be taught a lesson. Zelensky responds in a calm voice, "A lot of questions. Let's start at the beginning." Now, let's rejoin the footage.
First of all, during the war, everybody has problems. Even you, but you have nice ocean and don't feel now, but you will feel it in the future. God bless.
You don't know that.
God bless.
You don't
God
know that.
bless. You will not have a war.
Don't tell us what we're going to feel. We're trying to solve a problem. Don't tell us what we're going to feel.
I'm not telling you.
Because
I'm
you're in no
answering
position to
honest
dictate
questions.
that.
That's exactly
Remember
what
this.
you're doing.
You're in no position to dictate what we're going to feel. We're going to feel very
You will
good.
feel influenced.
We're going to feel very
I'm
good and
telling
very
you,
strong.
You will feel influenced.
You're right now not in a very good position. You've allowed
From the
yourself
very-
to be in a
from
very
the
bad
very
position,
beginning
and
of
he
the
happens
war.
to be right about
From the
it.
very beginning of the war.
You're not in a
Mr.
good
Brown,
position.
I
You don't have the
was-
cards right now. With us, you start having
not playing
cards. But
cards.
right now, you
I'm
don't.
very
Yeah, you're playing
serious,
cards.
Mr. President.
You're
I'm
playing
very
cards.
serious.
You're
I'm
gambling
the
with the
president
lives
of
of
the
millions of people.
You think-
You're gambling with World War III.
What do you think
You're
about-
gambling
what
with
do you
World
think
War
about-
III. And what you're doing is very disrespectful to the country, this country. That's
with
back
all
to you.
respect to you.
Far more than a lot of people said they should
Have
have.
you said thank you?
We have watched the exchange between Vance and Zelensky. Zelensky has spoken in a measured tone throughout, but has lobbed his own provocations towards Vance. Vance's voice has been a little louder, but he's not been shouting, he's just been firm in his delivery, and he has repeatedly issued provocations towards Zelensky. Zelensky continues explaining and then states, "You don't feel it now, you will feel it in the future." That is the issuing of a threat. Not a threat that he will do anything, but a threat that something will happen to the United States by way of them feeling the ramifications of Russia's activity in Ukraine and more widely. Again, he might be using the truth as a provocation, or that may not have any weight whatsoever, but again is being issued as a provocation. At this juncture, it's time for the President of the United States to wade in, operating almost like a tag team after Vance has delivered some blows. In wades Donald Trump. He states, "You don't know that. No, no, no. Don't tell us what we are going to feel." Again, Donald Trump's observation may be entirely accurate. You're not coming here telling us how we should be feeling about it. But notice, he doesn't make any allowance for the emotive nature of the discussion, that he's sat next to a man who, on the face of it, is seeking to defend his country against external aggression. There are others that believe that Zelensky is lining his pockets. Again, whatever your stance might be with regard to the relative positions and the rights and wrongs of the situation, what we're focusing on is the narcissistic dynamic that's taking place in this room. Trump has heard sufficient at this juncture to feel that he needs to intervene, and therefore he finds his observations, or rather the observation of Zelensky, to be a threat to control. He tells him, "You don't tell us how we are going to feel," in order to nullify the threat to control posed by what Zelensky says. He also puts his hand up, similarly utilizing a physical gesture in order to seek to silence Zelensky. You'll also note that a second after Trump does that, Vance does the same. He mirrors Trump in order to lend weight to what Trump is saying in order to seek to silence Zelensky. Nevertheless, Zelensky won't be silenced. Continuing to talk in a relatively calm tone, he keeps speaking, as does Donald Trump. And what we have is a minute or so of them talking over one another. Zelensky is trying to interrupt Trump, and Trump keeps wanting to tell him, "You're not in a good position, you don't have the cards." Again, irrespective of the relevant rights or wrongs of their respective positions, the fact is that you're seeing two narcissists jockeying for position here. One in a more calm and measured way, one demonstrating his usual blustering aggression, which is typical for the individual as an upper lesser type B. This is the modus operandi of Donald Trump in order to nullify threat to control. He's direct, he's to the point. He doesn't engage in going round and round the houses. That is part of his attraction to many people, and why many people also find that his behaviour is not statesmanlike. Once again, you'll form your own view as to whether you view that behaviour appropriate, but the point of it is, that is the way that he, driven by his narcissism, seeks to gain control. Zelensky is a different beast in that regard, operating with a facade and seeking to talk in more measured tones, but he's persistent. In a way, it's a little bit like a terrier dealing with a bulldog. The bulldog turns around and seeks to put him down. "You're not telling us how to feel. You're not in a good position. You don't have the cards." All very direct observations. Zelensky is more about talking and explaining, but nevertheless, he keeps nipping at Donald Trump in order to get his point across. He keeps interrupting, which shows an absence of boundary recognition on his part. Trump keeps on talking. Zelensky keeps trying to get his views in. Trump responds, "You're gambling with millions of people. You're gambling with World War III." Again, provocative language, emotive language, designed, of course, to nullify the threat to control. And there you have two contrasting styles of narcissists, but both engaging, both wanting to talk, both wanting to be heard, both wanting to ensure that they have control of the conversation, and neither is giving way. One continues to make deliberate points, the other trying to interject, and the result is that it doesn't actually allow any meaningful exchange to take place. You have two presidents jockeying for position, trying to get their views across. They may both be right with regard to their relative perspectives. They may both be wrong. But again, that's not the point here. The point is that neither are properly listening to the other. Both are entitled in wanting to get their views across, but they're doing it in slightly different styles, dependent upon the differences of their narcissism. Vance comes in and makes another provocative observation as the team tagging continues, and we're going to examine what happens next in part 2. Join me there.